across continents, linking Brazil, the United States, and the world in one shared mission. We are also very grateful to our supporting institutions, sponsors that made this possible: Silveira e Atias Law Firm, Matos Filho, BMA Law Firm, Newfields Brazil, Pinheiro Neto Law Firm. We also have partnerships: Brazilian American Institutes for Law and Environment, PACE Energy and Climate Center, IUCN Academy of Environmental Law, Ecological Law Consortium, Pará State Court, Univale, Brazilian Union for Environmental Advocacy, Climate Law and Governance Initiative, Center for International Sustainable Development Law, International Youth Watch, Brazilian Association of Environmental Public Prosecutors, and FGV Europe. I could not go ahead without saying special thanks to Professor Rômulo Sampaio for all that you have done for this event. This gathering could not be more timely as Brazil hosts COP30, a crucial milestone in the global response to climate change. Over the next 2 days, this side event will bring together experts, judges, policymakers, and advocates to discuss how the law can drive climate ambition. From just transition and indigenous rights to corporate accountability and climate finance. Beyond its legal dimension, this conference is a call for collaboration, openness, and shared purpose in addressing the climate crisis and reaffirming our commitment to the rule of the law as a foundation for sustainable development. Once again, I thank our partners and participants for joining us in this endeavor. May our discussion here in Rio de Janeiro and across Belém and New York serve as a meaningful contribution to the global dialogue leading to COP30 and beyond. Thank you, everyone. Please, Dean Horace Anderson, you have the words. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm Horace Anderson, Dean of the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University, joining you live from New York. It is my honor to welcome you to this landmark international conference hosted in partnership with our colleagues at FGV Rio Law. First, let me extend my sincere thanks to our sponsors and to FGV Rio Law for convening this important event. Our partnership is a reflection of the global collaboration that this moment requires, one that brings together legal scholars, policymakers, scientists, and advocates across continents. This year's COP30 marks 3 decades of global climate diplomacy and nearly a decade since the Paris Agreement, a pivotal moment in the world's effort to address the climate crisis, and the urgency has only grown. Despite decades of negotiation and progress, global emissions continue to rise, and the window for effective action is closing rapidly. Every year of delay narrows what can still be achieved and what can still be protected. The effects of climate change are visible in every region, with the most vulnerable nations and communities bearing the heaviest burdens of a crisis they did little to create. That reality makes this convening especially important. We are here not only to reflect on what has been done, but to confront what remains undone. How to strengthen national commitments, ensure real implementation, protect climate-vulnerable states, and make global cooperation more than words on paper. There is still time to act, but it demands urgency, accountability, and the kind of shared resolve that gatherings like this can inspire. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from experts and leaders who are shaping responses to these challenges, from questions of state responsibility and corporate accountability to the protection of indigenous communities and the advancement of climate justice. These are difficult conversations, but they are essential ones, and we are fortunate to have some of the best minds in the world assembled to explore them. Here at Pace Haub Law, we take pride in preparing students to be part of critical environmental, energy, and climate solutions. The next generation of legal and civic leaders is also here today, ready to learn, to lead, and to contribute to meaningful change. Thank you again to all who made this event possible and to all of you joining from around the globe. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to George Alex Nunez Atias from Silveira Atias Law. Thank you.
Okay, I have scribbled a few words to address you, but I guess it's not necessary anymore because Professor Horace and Professor Antonio have already said all the words that I would use to refer to this specific meeting. But anyway, I would like to address a few acknowledgements and thanks I guess I must say and I must address. First of all, I'd like to thank FGV for inviting us to be together with them in holding this conference, in this meeting. And I'm sure that this is just the first one, and we are supposed to have so many others in the future. And we are here to help in any way it's possible. It's under our possibilities. The second thing, I'd like to say thank you to Romulo Sampaio as well, who invited specifically our law firm to do that. Romulo, thank you very much. We are very happy to be here, and we hope, as I said, to have other opportunities in the future. And finally, I'd like to say a special thanks, and I'd like to say a few remarks about Pace University. You know, I've been to Pace in the early 2000s. And I was one of the coordinators of a program along with Universidade Federal do Pará and Universidade do Rio Grande do Sul, exchanging students to Pace. Daniel is one of those exchange students who were there. He's not young, he just seems young, but he looks young, but he's not that young. So he was one of the students in the early 20s, right? And there are some other students here who had the chance to go to New York City and have classes there at Pace. And you know, all those guys who came back, they are now wonderful professors at the University of Pará. They are responsible for helping and taking care of very important institutions, and some of them are still working as researchers on environmental issues. So it's just to say how important it is, those exchange programs, and how it's important to keep that global chain of connections with our institutions. It's very important. So having said that, I would like to go further and just make a few remarks about Belém. I've been to to Rio 92. I'm younger than that, believe me. I was very, very young at 92. So it surprises me that just we had to take 33 years to have another important meeting in Brazil, and especially in the Amazon region. And in the meantime, so much has been said about our city, about our cities, our people, and our region. And unfortunately, much was said, but very little was heard. So I think that this is for us, and I'm speaking on my behalf and of my colleagues here. It's the chance for us to be heard, and the people from the world to understand exactly what are our pains, what is our situation in fact, how are you going to face the problems with climate change, for example? And this is just one of the problems, the biggest one for sure, but it's one of the problems. We have other ones. We have problems with our cities. We have big cities here, and we have real problems with guys who live in the urban areas. So this is a special situation. And Belém was not just a city chosen, it's a statement. It's a statement of how important it is to hear people, to understand people, and to talk with them. We, of course, feel very glad to be defended, to be heard, and that our problems are discussed in international forums. But please, we want to be heard. And again, thank you to all those institutions that make possible that in this specific meeting, we have the chance to speak. And I hope we have a few more. Thank you very much.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce our incredible keynote speakers. But first, I have to thank our host here on the ground, Belém. Daniel, I thought you were young, so he ruined that surprise for me, certainly. Also have to particularly thank Emmanuel Paraiso at FGV for making all the logistics happen today. This literally could not be possible without him. And I have to thank Professor Nick Robinson and Dean Emeritus Ottinger at PACE for their vision and support. Without them, none of this would be possible. But with that, let's get on with the show. We are joined by two incredible keynote speakers. First, Mr. Selwyn Hart, the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Climate Action and Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team. I don't want to step on Mr. Hart's comments and his explanations of what he does, but he is very focused on the just energy transition, which is something that at PACE we are very focused on. I am the Executive Director of the PACE Energy and Climate Center. So this is work that we are very focused on. We're very fortunate to be here in Belém to understand and see it happening here in real time on the edge of the Amazon forest. And secondly, we'll be joined by Peggy Shepard, Executive Director of We Act, who implements environmental justice in my backyard, in my hometown of New York City. So I think we're going to see a really interesting juxtaposition and sort of a just energy transition globally, and how environmental justice can be so impactful locally. So with that, I'll pass the proverbial mic to Assistant Secretary General Selwyn Hart and Executive Director Peggy Shepard. Okay. Okay. Ms. Shepard, are you on the line by any chance? Okay. Sure. Absolutely. So I am the newly installed, I can't say that for much longer. It's been an excuse to be like, I'm not up to speak yet. The newly installed director of the PACE Energy and Climate Center. We have been around for over 35 years, started by Dean Emeritus Dick Ottinger, former congressman in Westchester, New York, which is where PACE Law School is located. Dean Ottinger was really a pioneer in bringing environmental issues to the United States Congress when the United States Congress cared about environmental issues, which, believe it or not, was not that long ago. But we are carrying on the legacy of the Energy and Climate Center, who have always been focused on fairness, equity. I don't think at the time it was happening, they called it environmental justice, but we had always been focused on sort of making sure energy burdens and the impacts of energy are not disproportionately felt by lower and moderate income communities. In New York State, New York City particularly, a lot of, and I'm sure this is no different than a lot of other parts of the world, a lot of the heaviest polluting fossil fuel plants tend to be in lower income neighborhoods. The neighborhood I grew up in, Astoria, a peaker plant right on Vernon Boulevard next to publicly funded housing, the Ravenswood housing projects. If you were to look at the health impacts of that, asthma rates are higher, right? Cancer rates are higher, life expectancy is lower. So the way the Energy Center has historically done that is through utility cases, rate-making cases, really focusing more on the energy costs, the energy burden. But here in 2025, what we are looking is we continue to focus on what's happening in our own backyard, particularly in Westchester, where our work is very embedded. We're looking to expand our footprint throughout downstate New York, and we're fortunate to have some additional support to do that in New York City, in Long Island, to make sure as energy costs, number one, that lower income communities are disproportionately affected by those costs. And with the climate law in New York City, for those of you who aren't aware, there's a CLCPA in New York State, I should say, that mandates a phase out of fossil fuel, which is really the core mission of the PACE Energy and Climate Center. So we are holding the state, various agencies in the state and certain energy producers' feet to the fire to ensure that they are not using the hostility from Washington, the inability to support financially, the unwillingness, I should say, to support financially clean energy projects from Washington as an excuse to make away from New York State's energy commitments. So we are here to hold the people in power accountable to make sure that the energy transitions in New York continues in a way that is fair to everybody on a global scale. In light of the ICJ advisory opinion, which we'll hear a lot about today and tomorrow, we want to help those who perhaps lack the capacity that we have, being part of the #1 environmental law program in the United States, to implement some of the solutions to the mandate set forth to the ICJ advisory opinion. And that means a just energy transition. We are looking forward to expanding our partnerships internationally, right? Continuing to write scholarship, continuing to make more partners, to make sure that not only does the energy transition not leave behind the most vulnerable communities, but also respects biodiversity, which of course here in the backyard of the Amazon is particularly relevant. So, with indigenous people expressing their concerns about what's happening. So we want to make sure that indigenous folks, low-income folks, coastal communities are protected as the world transitions to clean energy. Okay, would you like to talk a little bit about the work you guys are doing in that space?
Well, not exactly, but anyway.
So with that, we're going to go a little bit out of order, and we're going to toss it to Peggy Shepard from We Act, live from New York City.
Good morning. I'm Peggy Shepard, the co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a community-based organization that's been advocating for environmental and climate justice for the past 37 years. Now we have more than 1,000 members. We're based in Harlem, serving that community along with Washington Heights and Inwood here in New York City. In 2012, about 13 years ago, we opened a federal policy office in Washington, D.C. to influence federal programs and policies that could impact these neighborhoods. And we coordinate a national network of grassroots groups, about 40 from 23 states around the country, in order to ensure that those groups have a strong network where we can develop policy and other kinds of principles. Now, we got our start back in 1988 in opposition to the North River Sewage Treatment Plant, which was a facility that processed wastewater for almost the entire west side of Manhattan. Now, having been rejected by wealthier, whiter communities in Manhattan, the city decided to build the plant along the Hudson River in Harlem, a historically Black community, and it kept residents in the dark about the actual facts. And in fact, they agreed to build a park, Riverbank State Park, on top of the plant as a kind of concession to having this source of pollution in our community. But the park didn't hide the pollution. The sewage plant was built with open sewage tanks that stunk up the entire neighborhood. And because it was not built in accordance with the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, the plant was also pumping out toxic air emissions and water pollution from day one, adding to the already polluted air in our community. Well, we protested, we got into some good trouble, and eventually had to sue the city to have the plant fixed. The settlement we achieved provided funds, $55 million, to bring the brand new facility in line with legal requirements, along with a $1.1 million environmental health fund for the community. And we were able to use the funds to start West Harlem Environmental Action, which we know today as We Act for Environmental Justice. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with environmental justice, it is the movement to secure fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, culture, education, or income, with respect to the development, the implementation, and the enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Now, studies show that people of color and Black Americans in particular are subjected to disproportionate amounts of pollution from nearly every source imaginable, including industry, transportation, construction, agriculture, and even residential sources. Now, this environmental racism results from a complex legacy of housing segregation, land use and zoning discrimination, the inequitable environmental law enforcement, and government disinvestment at every level. Systemic and institutional environmental injustice results in disproportionate exposures to environmental hazards and polluting facilities, which contribute to health disparities and shortened lifespans. Now, this is true for the climate crisis as well, with studies showing that people of color and low income are the most impacted. For example, extreme heat is the deadliest impact of climate change, but it doesn't impact everyone equally. Now, here in New York City, Black folks are twice as likely to die from heat-related issue as white residents. Now, we've been making some progress in addressing these disparate impacts under the Biden administration. Good progress with programs like the Justice 40 initiative, which required government agencies to ensure their investments in the transition to clean, renewable energy, that those investments benefit low-income communities and communities of color. And federal funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law was really starting to flow to environmental justice communities across the country. Now, that's all changed under the new Trump administration, which doesn't seem to believe in science or any other evidence-based policies. They are waging a war on the environmental justice movement and have spent the better part of this year eliminating funding to address disparities in health and environmental protection and undermining the environmental regulations that we help put in place to protect our communities and making it easier to pollute these communities. Now, fortunately, We Act has a strong track record when it comes to passing legislation at the state and city levels, which, at least for the time being, appears to be somewhat insulated from actions of the Trump administration. Those severe federal cuts to state funding threaten environmental protection at every level. Now, back in 2022, we helped pass the New York State's environmental justice citing law. This landmark environmental justice legislation ensures that cumulative impacts from all sources of pollution in a community are taken into consideration in the state's environmental review and permitting processes when a potential source of pollution seeks a permit in a disadvantaged community. It's an historic move, making New York the second state in the nation with such a law, following New Jersey's groundbreaking legislation, which was signed in 2020. And that was advanced by the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and other groups there. Now, like the sewage treatment plant built in West Harlem, low-income communities and communities of color throughout New York State have historically been burdened by a disproportionate number of pollution-generating facilities, such as factories, power plants, bus depots, garbage dumps, and transfer stations and trucking centers. Now, this inequitable siting has turned our communities into environmental sacrifice zones, and the combined effects, what we call cumulative impacts, of the operation of these multiple sources of pollution harm our residents. They cause and exacerbate diseases like asthma, lung and heart disease, poor birth outcomes, and birth defects, learning impairments, among others. Now, the existing laws and regulations do not require government agencies to take the cumulative impacts of pollution into account when reviewing these kinds of facilities. Instead, agencies treat facilities as if they were the only source of pollution that residents would have to endure. That is why the environmental justice siting law is such a significant step in addressing the environmental racism that has plagued the health and the well-being of communities like ours for generations. Now, the state is in the process of making the rules for implementing the law, and we've been working with community-based and environmental justice organizations across New York State to make sure this law is as strong as it can be. And we have to be vigilant to ensure that laws are implemented. In 2019, we helped pass New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which sets strong emissions reduction goals for our state, mandating economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050 to bring them down from 1990 levels. However, the state has failed to issue regulations that are required to implement the law. So we, along with a group of advocates, have had to file a lawsuit to force the state to do that. And I'm happy to report that the court recently ruled in our favor, but the battle continues amid the state's continuing effort to nullify the requirements of the law. Now, you know, we have to be vigilant against federal efforts as well. Last year, we helped pass the New York State Climate Superfund Act. The law authorizes the state to require oil and gas companies that exceeded greenhouse emission thresholds between 2000 and 2018 to pay into a state-managed fund to finance New York's efforts to mitigate the climate-related impacts caused by these emissions. Efforts like coastal resilience, response to extreme weather events, and so on. So in essence, we're trying to hold polluters accountable. Now, the Trump administration and its allies in the oil and gas industry have filed lawsuits asking the courts to overturn the law. This group continues to prevent states from addressing the climate challenge, including suing to prevent implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and other efforts to reduce emissions and get climate change under control. Issues like the congestion pricing law that we've also helped pass in New York City. Now, you know, congestion pricing reduces emissions from vehicles in the most heavily trafficked areas of the city. Implementation of the law has significantly cleaned up our streets and our air, as well as generating funding for transit improvements. We've also helped pass a state city law ensuring that new buildings will be built without the use of fossil fuels, because buildings burning fossil fuels account for 70% of the emissions in New York City. Now, last year, after a long campaign by environmental justice advocates, New York City issued the Environmental Justice New York City Report, which is a comprehensive report on the environmental justice issues impacting our neighborhoods here in Harlem, and around the city, and it's called the Environmental Justice New York City Report. Now, when I started We Act, one of our goals was to ensure that environmental justice was on the city's agenda, that our political leaders understood the disproportionate burdens our communities face, and that they were willing to work toward equitable solutions to address these disparities. That's why we advocated for New York City legislation, which required the city to develop a study of environmental justice areas, the establishment of an environmental justice portal, and to produce a plan for addressing the issues that have been identified. 2 years later, both of those bills passed, becoming Local Law 60 and 64 of 2017. Now, it took far longer than necessary, but in April 2024, the city finally released the Environmental Justice New York City Report and Mapping Tool. Now, as chair of the New York City's Environmental Justice Advisory Board, which provided guidance on the development of the report, I am pleased with the outcome. It is a good, comprehensive report. It ensures that environmental justice is on the city's agenda. And now that we have this report and mapping tool, everyone in city government can fully understand the disproportionate environmental burdens our communities face. What comes next, though, is even more important. That is developing a comprehensive citywide plan to address the environmental justice issues identified in the report. Engaging with the residents of New York City's environmental justice communities, those who are most impacted by these issues, is going to be critical in developing effective and equitable solutions. Now, this work, partnering with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, had received funding from the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, but the Trump administration illegally terminated that grant, so we're doing our best to make it happen despite the effort to undermine the work. We will continue to resist at the federal level and to work to ensure that equitable solutions are passed and protected at the city and state levels. Now, given the history of the environmental justice movement, we know that we cannot count on government at any level to do what's needed for our communities. Those with the power, those with the money, have long taken advantage of our communities, turning them into dumping grounds for pollution and sacrificing the health and well-being of all who live there. But we have learned to fight back. We've learned how to organize and advocate and how to pass laws that protect us. Now we're learning how to protect those laws in the courts and at the ballot box. So thank you very much for being here and for listening today.
Peggy, thank you so much for those amazing words, and more importantly, the work your organization is doing in New York City. I cannot emphasize enough how important that work is. But with that, we are very lucky to be joined by Selwyn Hart, the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Mr. Hart.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you and good morning. Really great to see all of you, and it's a pleasure to join this session. And really, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but unfortunately or fortunately, I'm here at the conference venue at COP30. And I really want to thank our friends from the School of Law at Pace University, as well as the Rio Law School, really for co-hosting this really important event. At the outset, let me confess that I'm not a lawyer. I've never done one single legal course in my life. I'm a diplomat and an economist. So if you're looking for any legal insights from me, unfortunately, you will get none. But President Lula and the Secretary General, they've both titled this COP as a COP of truth, right? A COP where the truths on the science and the reality of climate have been laid bare. And quite frankly, it is now up to governments and other stakeholders to take the required action. Now, this COP is taking place against the backdrop of an extremely complex geopolitical environment. We see rising geopolitical tensions and divisions. We see the emergence of climate denialism and pushback, domestic pushback in many key countries to climate action. And this is all in the context of what the science continues to tell us and what we're seeing in real time. The science tells us that the climate crisis is getting worse. It's accelerated despite some progress over the course of the first 10 years of implementation of the Paris Agreement. We're still not going fast enough, and our climate goals, including the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, is slipping out of reach. And in real time, we're seeing on every continent really these what used to be once in 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years events become annual occurrences. So, but the economics have shifted. Over the course of the first 10 years of the Paris Agreement, we've seen an acceleration of the clean energy transition. Renewables are now cheaper, they're faster, they're much safer. And I often use this example. 10 years ago, going into Paris, it took 1 week to deploy 1 gigawatt of solar. This year, it will take just 12 hours, right? So we're seeing this rapid scale up of many of the solutions to solve the climate crisis. But again, we're still not moving fast enough. And the investments in clean energy are highly concentrated in China and the advanced economies. Since the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, 4 out of every $5 invested in clean energy has gone to China and the advanced economies. So countries, the rest of the world, or countries representing 2/3 of the global population have attracted a mere 1 out of every $5 since Paris. And nowhere is this injustice more apparent than in Africa. Last year, Africa attracted just 2% of global clean energy investments, despite having 60% of the world's best solar potential, 30% of the critical energy transition minerals needed for the energy transition. So the issue, and I'm glad that I came on after the last speaker, the reality is that as we look at the outcome of COP30, the Secretary General has been calling for the COP outcome to send a very clear signal that the next decade needs to be a decade of acceleration and implementation, because we have the tools when we know that we're not going fast enough. But acceleration and implementation, while absolutely essential, the outcome must also ensure that the different transitions, that as we look at acceleration and implementation, that justice and equity are embedded across the board in these transitions. Because the current situation, as I said, in the energy transition, developing countries for the most part, and Africa in particular, are being locked out of the transition. And if this transition is going to be different from the fossil fuel era, justice and equity must be embedded. And on the adaptation and resilience front, the reality is that those that have contributed the least to the climate crisis, even in rich countries, are having to pay the highest price and burden. So if you're a small island developing state, if you're a least developed country, if you're African, if you're an African country, and as well as poor communities in rich country, these communities and individuals and countries are paying the highest price as it relates to the climate crisis. I just returned from an event on early warning systems, and it was an initiative that the Secretary General launched a few years ago on early warning systems for all. You know, we have all of the technologies, the science is on our side, but the reality is that 6 out of every 10 Africans are not protected by an effective early warning system. And this is the most basic tool to save lives and safeguard livelihoods. And 2/3 of all small island developing states and least developed countries don't have effective early warning systems in place. So as we look at the climate crisis, it is littered, and really it is an absolute case study in climate injustice, both on the energy transition side, but also on the adaptation and resilience front. So there was this really historic decision by the ICJ a few months ago, and this followed on from an earlier decision by the International Tribunal on the law of the sea. We were a bit surprised, and I dare say happy with how specific and targeted and detailed this historic opinion was, confirming that all states have a legal obligation under international law to protect the global climate system. And it really represented a victory for young people, especially from the Pacific small islands, who had the courage to make this possible. Now, will this be reflected in the formal outcome of the COP? This has been a question where there has been a lot of speculation. I don't know. I don't think so, because of course the General Assembly has not yet acted on the advisory opinion. But nevertheless, it really, the opinion has been historic, and it's already having its impact in terms of helping to shape climate policy. My own personal view is that I think over the course of the coming years, you will see across the world, in many countries, increased litigation, as you've seen in countries like Korea, where young people really took the government to court and also won a historic ruling as well. Because the reality is no government has the excuse of scientific uncertainty anymore. No company, especially the fossil fuel industry, that continues to preach denialism and delayism, lack of scientific clarity or scientific uncertainty is no longer a legitimate excuse. So as you continue your work on this really important and critical area, it will be useful for us to hear from you how you believe that the legal profession and law, international law, but also domestic law, really can support the acceleration and implementation that the world desperately needs in the second decade of the Paris Agreement. Because as I suspect that this second decade, we will see, as we head into the second decade of the Paris Agreement, we will see a significant increase in legal action as countries confront the realities of the climate crisis. So my humble appeal to you is really to continue to work with us. We've established, or working to establish, a relationship with Pace University, because we will definitely need your help and support as we move into the second decade of the Paris Agreement. So thank you so much for this opportunity to brief you, and I look forward to hearing more from you in the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary General Hart, for taking time away from your very, very important work at the COP to spend just these precious moments with us. I can speak on behalf of everyone at PACE that we are looking forward to continue working with you to ensure that just energy transition occurs and that the ICJ advisory opinion is implemented. So with that, I think we're going to move on to our next in-person panel. So coming to the stage is Professor Achinti Vithandajaj, Dr. Brendan Mackey, Carlos Nobre, and youth commentator, Elisabeth Haub, Pace School of Law student, Ashley Gentile.
Wonderful. Hello, bom dia, everyone. Welcome. And it feels funny that I'm saying welcome at least to the audience here because you welcomed me so warmly and all of us. So thank you for having us. Welcome to everyone who is in Rio as well as in White Plains back home. We are excited to kick off this first panel with you all. And it is, again, as all my four speakers mentioned, that this is a conference that is running along with a side of the COP conference at Belém. Now, my name is Achinti Vithandajaj, and I am the executive director of the environmental law program at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. I'm also a professor there, and many of you in this audience who are, and I'm not sure if there are any law students, but there might be some here, or there might be some later on today. But we have lawyers, we have law professors, we have members of the bar, we will have judges and activists. We had Peggy Shepard earlier, who is an activist as well. And then there'll be law students as well who'll be joining us. And you all know that when it comes to something like the environmental crises that we have today, what is the use of environmental law if we are not basing it on science and basing it on good and current science? And so this cannot be clearer than, of course, the climate change context that we have today. Now, we are 3 days into the COP, and you just heard from the UN Assistant Secretary General Hart. And he mentioned one thing that was very important, and that was President Lula's focus with this COP presidency to make this a COP of truth, right? Focusing on getting rid of misinformation, but also upholding science. And science is definitely the reason why we have today's panel and that's why we're kicking off today's panel here as well. Now, they talked about the importance of truth and that this is a space to confront that truth and the reality of the truth we see in science itself, right? So the other thing to remember is that the truth is not always a pleasant one. But for those who, we're in this beautiful air-conditioned space, and of course, but for those who live in Belém, otherwise, for those who have been attending COP, like myself and Brendan, we've seen how attending this it's been a sweltering heat, right? Pleasant at times, but really it has been a sweltering heat. And it is not a pleasant feeling as a result. What we feel the heat, we feel the truth in that process. And according to a recently published study, which is led by the Federal University of Pará here, Belém has faced 2 decades of temperature rises, 1.5 degrees above its average. This means that Belém is already living the future of high temperatures that we've been trying to avoid, right? So just as COP30 has placed science at the forefront of our minds, we're going to do so as well here with this conference. And we're trying to use science also as our guiding light, right? Not just our foundation, but also as our guiding light. So I'm delighted to welcome two outstanding experts from the world of science. We're going to have two experts. One is joining us very shortly, but we're getting things going to make sure we stay on track today. We have Dr. Carlos Nobre is going to join us very shortly. I don't think he needs any introduction here in Brazil. He's quite well known here. He is a world-renowned Earth system scientist from Brazil, and Dr. Nobre's work mostly focuses on the Amazon, where we are, and its impacts on the Earth system. He is the co-chair of the science panel for the Amazon and the leader of the Amazonia 4.0 project. He has also been a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and has served as National Secretary for Research and Development Policies at the Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation of Brazil, and the President of Brazil's Agency for Postgraduate Education. His list of accolades goes on, and I encourage you to look up his bio when you have the chance, especially those who are outside of Brazil. And then the other expert that we have here is sitting right next to me. We have Dr. Brendan Mackay, who is a fellow Australian. He is the director of the Griffith Centre, the Griffith Centre's Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University, which is in Queensland, Australia. Professor Mackay was a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, so the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report Working Group 2, which focuses on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. He's also contributed to many side events over many years. Since 2008, I believe he's been participating, and he's contributed to conversations that range around forest protection to ensure climate mitigation, but also working towards the 30 by 30 policy agenda as well. Professor Mackay also served 2 terms on the Council for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, also known as the IUCN. And so within the IUCN, he has also co-chaired a climate working group, which led to a phase shift in how IUCN has engaged with climate change as a topic and as a crisis, and also with UN climate negotiations as well. The Climate Working Group also prepared the groundwork for the establishment of the IUCN's Climate Crisis Commission, which is now known as the Climate Action Commission. And he's a member of the steering committee of that commission itself. And finally, we are also joined by Ashley Gentile, a second-year law student at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. Ashley is a Haub student scholar and is currently interning with the UN mission to Tajikistan at the New York headquarters of the UN. He will serve as our youth commentator for today. He's also one of many youth who will be participating throughout our conference. We've tried to ensure that youth have a real included voice throughout the entire conference. And so there will be a youth commentator in every session. All right, and so to begin, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mackay to provide us some opening comments.
Thank you very much. So you can hear me okay, thank you. Yes, well, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you for the walk here and for the introductions, and to everyone online. So about my favorite topic. And so you mentioned the IPCC. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change plays a critical role here. So we've heard from one of our keynote speakers about the rise of disinformation, climate disinformation, and denialism. So how do we know what we know? How do we know what reliable climate information is? Well, that's where the IPCC comes in. It's on a 7-year cycle. There are 3 working groups looking at how the climate's changing, how it's projected to change, and how do we know what's due to human causes. The second group reviews the published peer review research about the impact of a changing climate, projected climate impacts, the vulnerability of human and natural systems, and how we can adapt to the rising risks and impacts. And the third working group reviews the published scientific information about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and related issues. So the IPCC does not conduct research. It makes assessments, rigorous assessments of the peer-reviewed research, published research findings, and on those three broad themes, and the scientific reports from authoritative agencies such as NASA, other research entities. So published by the IPCC are assessment reports that provide us with the most reliable, up-to-date scientific information about how the climate is changing, why it's changing, how it's projected to change, what the impacts and risks are, and what we can do about it, both in terms of mitigation of greenhouse gases and adapting to these escalating climate risks. So I want to go over 1, 2, 3, 4 of the kind of key scientific findings and outcomes that we can be very confident about, which really need to frame and inform the climate action we take, including the many implications it has for our regulatory environments and frameworks. The first is it's now an established scientific fact that the climate change that we're observing, particularly over the last 100 years, and particularly since the 1970s, is strongly influenced by human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. There is no uncertainty about this, which is a remarkable thing scientifically, and because science is defined by the ability to quantify confidence intervals and the error. But the confidence intervals have been getting narrower and narrower and narrower with every assessment, to the extent it's now 95 to 100%, which is classified as virtually certain, i.e. it's a known scientific fact. So as our previous speaker said, there is no basis for climate denialism now in that regard. The other established scientific fact is that the main metric we have of climate change is called the global warming index. It compares Earth's average global temperature to what it was in when the industrial era started, about 1850, and we're now at about 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and it's looking like we're going to hit 1.5 around 2030. Again, people have to understand that is a scientific metric. It's analogous to your body temperature when you go to your general practitioner and she puts a thermometer in your mouth and takes your temperature. If it's 37 degrees, she sends you home. If it's 38 degrees, it's diagnostic that there's a health problem here. If it's 40 degrees, you'll call the ambulance. It's a life-threatening. So by analogy, this global warming index of degrees above pre-industrial, a healthy Earth temperature is 0, right? We're now at 1.3. It's a fever, and 1.5 degrees has been identified scientifically as equivalent, I'd say, to a 40-degree body temperature. It's life-threatening because it's a threshold after which we start to see a rapid non-linear increase in irreversible change and increasing loss and damage. So what are the changes that have been observed? Well, there are two broad kinds. One are called climate trends and the other are called climate extremes. So the climate trends is rising temperature. Everywhere is getting warmer and hotter. It's just getting warmer and hotter at different rates. Actually, it's getting hotter at higher latitudes, an Arctic Circle, and higher elevations. So in Nepal, they're +6 degrees above pre-industrial level. Up in the Arctic Circle, it's even warmer than that. A second climate trend is sea level rise. 90% of the additional heat in the Earth system is going to warm the ocean, 90%. And as you heat water, what happens? It expands and the sea level rises. Even if we shut off all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the sea level will continue to rise for another 300 years, just from the committed warming that's in the oceans. And the third is shifting patterns of rainfall, which are very disruptive. The second major impact is increase in the frequency and severity and duration of all extreme weather events, droughts, heavy rainfall and flooding, heat waves, catastrophic wildfire, cyclones and storms. These are all getting more severe, they're getting more frequent, and they're getting longer. So every increment of global warming, every 0.1 of a degree of global warming results in an increase in the frequency and severity duration of all extreme weather events. So this is the significance of this 1.5 degree target. It's been scientifically established through a special IPCC report that once we get beyond that, we start to trigger these irreversible changes. An example of them is tropical coral reefs are very sensitive to marine heat waves, of course, coral bleaching. They can regenerate, but it takes about 10 years. Once we get above 1.5 degrees, the tropics starts to experience marine heat waves at a frequency of more than once every 10 years. So eventually, tropical coral reefs everywhere will start to experience that frequency, and they will not be able to generate. It's a systems change. There are other what are called tipping points that start to kick in after 1.5 degrees, which are major Earth system processes that affect the climate. One of them is the global ocean circulations, which carry heat from the equator up to the northern latitudes. There's a certain temperature where there's a major risk they'll shut down, which will have a major impact on the climate. A third major category of impact is ocean acidification, which is not really a climate change problem. It's the product of us putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere. It's changing the acidity of the atmosphere, which affects marine life. So that's what's happening, and every increment of global warming, those climate trends and extremes will continue to worsen and accelerate. Now, a recent innovation in climate science, which I think is really important to highlight here in the remaining time I've got, is called climate attribution science. And this is particularly relevant, I think, to the legal world and issues concerning liability and damage and duty of care and other causes of climate litigation action. So what's climate attribution science? Well, let me take a step back. How do we know that the climate change that we can observe in the meteorological record is due to what we're doing? And how can we make these projections into the future? Well, that's because we have these very sophisticated computer-based models called climate change models. They're actually Earth system models. They're modeling the whole Earth system and how the atmosphere and oceans and land interact in the exchange of energy and water and carbon to drive our climate system. And so you can run these models, you can do different simulations, you can spin them up from 1850 and run them without human greenhouse gas emissions, and you can run them with human greenhouse gas emissions, and you can compare those two simulations to the observed record in the meteorological record. And the only way you can reproduce the current climate that we have is when you include the human emissions. So that's, if you like, a kind of Earth system attribution. That's how we know it's one of the main lines of evidence. But what about an extreme event like the big wildfires that happened in Australia a few years back, and the big wildfire that burnt parts of California down, and the big mega fire that happened in Quebec, and the most recent tropical cyclones and typhoons that we've seen, category 5s? Are they due to human forced climate change, human influenced climate change? People, until very recently, scientists would say we can't tell you that, but that has now changed. We have now climate attribution science, which can ask these questions. After such an event has happened, after a mega wildfire, after a mega category 5 tropical cyclone or typhoon, you can ask these questions. How much more likely was that event as a result of human forced climate change? And how much more severe was that event as a result of human-forced climate change? And you get an answer like, it was 20% more likely and 30% more severe. You can also do the next kind of attribution, which is, okay, this is how much humans have influenced the event. Well, that climate has impacted on human and natural systems and caused damage. So you can also then do a loss and damage calculation and say, well, how much more damage was done to the coastal ecosystem or to the city from flooding or the houses that were burned as a result of the human influence climate change. So you can do the climate attribution science enables you to look at how much humans have caused the event to be worse and also how much more damage has been done because of that influence. So this is a powerful new branch of climate science. There's an international network of researchers based in Europe and the UK who are driving this analysis. And there's a website called Weather Attribution. You can Google that. And the analysis is done very quickly, like a week after these events. That data is up on their website. So I think this is a particular branch of climate science that the legal world really needs to pay attention upon because it provides you with very concrete evidence for many courses of climate litigation. So just to conclude very, very quickly, climate science is really Earth system science. And when Carlos comes, he'll be able to unpack that in greater detail. And the other thing that science more generally has told us about the Earth system is that it's a complex adaptive system. It's not a simple system like a jet engine. A jet engine's complicated, but it's simple. You know, a jet engine engineer can completely control and manage a jet engine. A jet engine engineer, you know, knows how to adjust it, and he or she can make these adjustments and know exactly what will happen. Earth is a complex adaptive system, right? It can't be controlled. It can't be managed. It can be understood. There are points of leverage in that system we can influence, and we're doing that now by emitting CO2 emissions. But it has feedbacks, complex feedbacks, and nonlinear responses and unpredictable behavior. So, you know, when it comes to humans and the Earth system, there should be a big label which is handled with care, right? Tread very carefully. This is not a system you can control. That's a major lesson from climate science.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Thank you so much, Dr. Mackey. I think I had so many things that I would like to comment on, but I have to leave way for our student commentator to have that first go at making those comments. So, Ashley, over to you.
Well, thank you, Professor Mackey and Professor Pathanahe. I mean, it's petrifying what you have to say, very scary. And like Professor Pathanahe said, I do spend a lot of time sitting in the UN, listening to these prepared statements regarding climate change, and they're not the hard science because they don't just give the facts as they're given. They're influenced by the politics, by the social systems, and I think that's really important, and we do need to see it that way. And we do also need to understand that we need to be working on the enabling conditions to affect the understanding of the science in policy more broadly. And what I mean by that is that the law itself is a system that's complex, adaptive in itself, and we need to understand that we can't just focus on each individual problem. We have to be looking at the human rights aspect, the peace and security. And so in the UN, there is this push by a lot of states to narrow the mandate just toward peace and security. And that's really not scientific because it's rejecting that everything's interconnected. And the recent ICJ opinion kind of said that, you know, it used systemic integration to understand what climate accountability of states should be. So yeah, bringing like the science and the policy together is really important. Then additionally, just thinking about the other things that I've heard this morning, and the Paris Agreement, just broadly, we should be working towards, I suppose, you know, this polycentric approach. We heard Peggy, and I'm a I live in Harlem and I'm like a card holding member of We Act if they had cards. And my daughter's birthday was on the park on top of the sewage plant the other day. And of course, so there's, and you know, you're on there and you know what's happening. And it's like, you've got this effective understanding of what's going on. I mean, that's not quite climate. That's not that experience, but it's an environmental experience. And that kind of knowledge has to be integrated as well. And well, how can that be integrated? I suppose through a lot of what we're trying to do, things like youth on panels, but also in decision making, in NDCs, we need to be looking at incorporating how youth can be involved, how indigenous communities can be involved, local communities on the ground, and where climate education can be put into the NDCs, because that's the only way forward, really. But I'll pass it back to you because obviously we have much more to hear.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Incredibly insightful thoughts. I really do appreciate how you brought some of your own experiences to what Dr. Mackey was talking about. But now we've been joined by our other expert, Dr. Nurbury. Unfortunately, you missed the wonderful introduction I gave about you. So, so we're just going to launch straight into it. As you all heard, Dr. Nurbury, amazing Earth system scientist from Brazil. I'm going to hand it over to you to provide your initial comments.
Good morning to all. Thank you very much for the invitation. An apology, I got 10 minutes late because, you know, I was in important events at the COP30, the Blue Zone, and it was very complicated to get out. And also, of course, the traffic. Anyway, but thank you very much. Let me say, you know, the panel here, the accelerating climate crisis. I'm a climate scientist, and I just want to tell you how we climate scientists, we know about the risks. I'll tell you a little bit of the history of my education. I was doing my PhD at MIT in US, 1977, 82. And my advisor was a top scientist at that time, one of the best scientists, meteorology, climate. His name was Jules Charney. And he was the first person leading an assessment report, the associations of the science associations in the West created. That was 1979. And then in August of 1979, they finished the report. And they presented in Washington. When he came back from Washington, he had a meeting with the 3 PhD students, myself and 2 Italians. And then he told us everything that the report was saying. It is 46 years ago. And he said, listen, we cannot let the temperature reach 1.5 degrees, no way. 1.5. And then he gave one explanation. When the temperature reaches 1.5 degrees warming, and he gave this data, the hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico would become much, much stronger. In hurricanes, you have categories of speed, wind speed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 is very rare, 250 kilometers per hour. And he said that because no way, we cannot let the temperature reach 1.5 degrees. And now that we almost reach 1.5 degrees for, as you know, 21 months, second half 2023, 2024, several months this year, WMO said this year will be the second warmest after 2024. And we have seen a much increase in hurricanes category 3, 4, and 5. This one that killed thousands of people now a few weeks ago in the Gulf of Mexico, Jamaica, Cuba, etc., category 5. So I'm just saying, and now science a few years back said, if we reach 2 degrees warming, the Gulf of Mexico will generate hurricanes category 6. more than 350 kilometers per hour. And it's interesting because all infrastructure in the Amazon states affected by hurricanes, Texas, Florida, and other, they all construct to resist category 5. Why I'm saying that? Because you see, the science knows, I'm saying, that first assessment report, 1979, said, we should not get more than 1 degree warming. And I was also in the first IPCC report, 1990. And then that report really said all the risks. And one of the things that we are discussing there is that warming was close to 0.5 degrees. And we said we should not exceed 1 degree warming. And for that, we would have to get to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2000. And then, if we succeeded, temperature would go from almost 0.5 to 1 up to, by now, it would be 1 degree, and it would stabilize and then even get lower. So I'm just saying, science is saying for decades, why we don't change, and the emissions increase, actually from 1990s, 2000, 2010, record-breaking increase in emissions. Fortunately, in the last 5-6 years, the growth rate decreased, but 2024, the highest emission rate in the history. So, and as you know, now the science said we are going to reach 1.5 degrees permanently in 5 to 10 years, no more than 10 years. So we are going to reach 1.5 degrees warming permanently before 2035. And this COP is very important because if we, as you recall, Paris Agreement, COP26, 2021 in Glasgow, Scotland, all countries agree on emissions reduction to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees. And what science was saying in 2021 was fast reduction by 43% now, 2030, compared to 2019. And then net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, we are not reducing. It's big mystery what will be 2025. We are really hoping it will be the first year with reduction. We have to wait a few more months. But the science says it's not going to be a very fast emissions reduction, like 42%, what the science was saying. And that they say, this very rapid emissions reduction because, CO2 molecule, carbon dioxide, it stays for about 150 years in the atmosphere. So that's why we have to reduce very rapidly to avoid the warming to exceed. So, but we know now, unfortunately, it will be 1.5 degrees. And then if we are able to reduce emissions very rapidly, we may get 1.5 degrees with the overshooting. And then we have to remove, not only to get to net zero emissions, but also to start removing 5-6 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So I'm just saying that because I think, people did not realize that at 1.5, the climate extremes increase exponentially. It's not a small increase. Exactly what happened 2023, 2024, and even this year. All extremes, all climate extremes broke all records. Heat waves, droughts, wildfires, excessive rainfall, excessive wind speed. And unfortunately, people did not realize that was going to happen, particularly because since even science was saying we might reach 1.5 degrees post 30. Science was 2022. Science was saying we are going to reach, for the first time, 1.5 degrees, perhaps 2028, before 2035. No, now we know we have reached. Then all the extremes, and also most of the population don't realize or did not know the extreme that's leading to the highest number of death is heat waves. Heat waves are leading to more than 500,000 deaths a year. In Brazil, tens of thousands of deaths. And all the other extremes. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, even with 1.5 degrees warming, and as I say, science is saying we have to work a lot to go to 1.7 degrees overshooting, and then to remove a minimum 5-6 billion of tons, get net zero emissions, and then remove. And we launched here in Brazil last week in Rio, Brazilian Academy of Science, a study that we finished demonstrating that Brazil can get to net zero emissions by 2040, rapidly reducing fossil fuel consumption. For instance, only 22-24% of Brazil's emissions is fossil fuels. In Brazil, land use change, mostly deforestation, second, agriculture. So really all those climate extremes. So that's what I'm saying. I just want to finish by saying, so we have these two big challenges. These, let's say, the just transition would be very rapidly to reduce emissions, mostly fossil fuels. And also, in case you don't recall, fossil fuels, coal, oil, diesel, they are the causes of urban air pollution, including here in Belém. And urban air pollution all over the world leads to 7 million deaths, leads to 2 to 4 years, life expectancy reduced 2 to 4 years. So it's terrible, this pollution. So also a big benefit for billions of people would be really to get to zero emissions, to zero fossil fuel use very rapidly. And in our study, we show, and also, of course, in Brazil, to get zero deforestation. Zero deforestation. Brazil has a plan to get to zero deforestation by 2030. President Lula announced this in his speeches here. And also to create very large scale forest restoration. In fact, if any of you will be in the blue zone this afternoon at 2 p.m., we are having a meeting with the Brazil Development Bank, BNDES, showing that Brazil created the project called Arc of Restoration. We want to restore a lot of these deforested areas. This project to restore 240,000 square kilometers, 60,000 from now 2030, 180,000 square kilometers 2030, 2050. Sorry. So it will be in this action room 2 there in the blue zone. We are going to discuss how to implement this forest restoration. So Brazil is working in that direction. And last, let me say the big challenges is to increase tremendously the adaptation. We have more than 2 billion people in the world. In Brazil, more than 45 billion of people totally vulnerable to these climate extremes. In Brazil, we have more than 4 million people living in houses, in areas, tremendous risk of severe precipitation, rainfall, mostly landslides. That's what takes largest number of deaths here for these extreme events. And also along, on the edge of the rivers in Rio Grande do Sul last year, the record-breaking rainfall destroy more than 20,000 houses on the edge of the river. So therefore, we really, this is people suffering from the excessive rainfall. But of course, the big challenge is tens of millions of people, elderly, babies, children less than 5 years, people with some illness, the problem of heat waves. That's really what takes to this large number of deaths. And Brazil has a big problem. Only 22% of residents in Brazil have air conditioners because electricity is so expensive in Brazil that people cannot afford it. As you know, when there is a heat wave, sometimes a heat wave is 7, 10, 9 days. So you have to keep the air conditioner all the time. Poor people don't have how to pay, they don't have it. And also, unfortunately, Brazil is one of the countries in the world with the least urban forests. I've been 8 days in China in September. I was so well impressed. Shanghai and Beijing, beautiful forests all over these cities. Brazil does not have. You can see here, Belém is not the worst. The worst is São Paulo. But still, so therefore, also to protect, resilience, increasing resilience to more than 30, 40 million Brazilians for heat waves, you have really to work a lot. And also there are nature-based solutions like, planting trees on the roofs. And also those things we don't grab. So I would say those are the big challenge, and certainly we can do. Technology exists. We have to find the financial system, but it's absolutely possible to increase the resilience of all this, but also, of course, in the world. So this is the climate emergency, but the big challenge, you've seen the other day, Bill Gates saying, no, we don't have to worry too much about, emissions. We have only to worry about adaptability. No, that's not true. And I will finish by saying a big risk. As you know, the Amazon is at the edge of a tipping point. Coral reefs, the Amazon, permafrost, Greenland ice sheets, all at the, if the temperature exceeds 1.5 degrees, reach 2 degrees, all those tipping points will be reached. And the Amazon, if global warming reach 2 degrees, the temperature here will be 2.7, 3 degrees with the forest. Without the forest, if we lose the forest, the temperature will be 4 to 5 degrees warmer here in Belém. And then by 2070, studies show in Belém and many other areas in the equatorial areas here in the Amazon, sea level cities like Belém, inhabitable for humans. Inhabitable. So if we continue with global warming and we lose the forest, inhabitable, because if the temperature is very warm and with humidity, we humans, we cannot lose heat. We don't transpire anymore. If we cannot transpire and the air temperature is above our body temperature, or more than 35 degrees, then babies and elderly people survive only half an hour to 1 hour. Very healthy grown-ups 2 to 3 hours. So it becomes inhabitable. I'm just saying this climate emergency, tremendous risks. So we have really to work, all of us, together to combat the worst environmental disaster that we put the planet on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Norberg, and especially for giving us such a good Brazilian and Belém context as well. So I'm going to give it again to Ashley, if you would like to give a couple of minute comments on what Dr. Norberg said, and then I'll have a couple of questions for our panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you said, and thank you, just reinforces what I was saying before. This idea that we need to systemically integrate everything. I also, I mean, there's so much to comment on. I also some of the later things that you said, the rhetoric that I often hear is, yes, everything's not going very well, but don't worry because the most economically viable thing is a green transition anyway. And that's not necessarily the healthiest way to look at this. We do need much greater change, and it does need to be like more reinforced in that justice area and not just like on a veiled level. So, you know, thinking about the financial things that we can do, we talk about like green swaps, climate swaps, but really is that just embedding like history of like neo-colonialism, like the Washington Consensus, and just like letting that debt happen, and now we're just using a financial instrument to do that. So we need to reform the whole international system. So yeah, I think that's the main takeaway I get from you.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. So I think one of the things that you're getting through this context is, and also having a group of lawyers here in the room as well, is trying to understand what is that going to be, that intersection between science, policy, and law. How do we translate this knowledge that we already have that is continuously developing into effective policy and law? And you know, it's funny to ask the scientists, hey, could you tell us what you think might be good? But I think where it might be interesting to hear from is, from the array of like policies and laws that you've seen, where do you feel like science has been done well and has been incorporated well, or where is there a gap that you think that we can definitely do better in incorporating science? Dr. Mackey, do you want to go ahead first?
Yes. So the climate treaty negotiations themselves are kind of informed by science, but only kind of. So if you look at who are the delegates who are doing the negotiations, these people generally have law and economics degrees. From China, they actually have a lot of engineers. Like a lot of their elected politicians are actually engineers, right? So they have a lot of technical people. But most of the delegates, and this Brazil is a good example, are very well trained professional diplomats, right? But that's true for most of them. Australian delegates are all professional diplomats. So, you know, the level of what I would call climate literacy amongst the negotiators is very low. And that's the first point. And secondly, the nature of international negotiations is still dominated by short-term national self-interest, right? So yes, governments have signed the UNFCCC. There are commitments there about climate change and ecological integrity of Earth being a common concern, et cetera. But when push comes to shove, the actual negotiations are still very much framed by professional diplomats who have got, you know, they're working off a list of priorities that are, you know, very much dominated by relatively short-term national self-interest. So that's why I think this COP president called out the science and said we need to be actually listening to the science to be guiding and framing the negotiations. I mean, the 1.5, you know, threshold, it is scientifically, you know, established. It is meaningful. It was politically negotiated at Paris, and it was the world community was dragged to it by the small island nation states, right? Tuvalu in particular, and they were listening to the science. So, you know, I think the challenge is still there in the COPs. We need to be, you know, working out ways of making sure the science is heard. I would like to start every COP with a presentation by someone like yourself, right? Or the current head of the IPCC current assessment report, have them give an opening address saying this is what the science is telling us. The science is still somewhat buried in the negotiations and drawn upon when convenient and ignored when not convenient.
Great comments.
Well, yes, I fully agree. I just want to compliment, yes, the president of COP30, Ambassador André Correa do Lago, invited me and Johann Rockstrom from Peak Institute in Germany for us to create, for the first time in 30 COPs, this planetary science pavilion. So we create the Blue Zone. You were all invited. And he put this challenge to us: please bring the top scientists from all over the world, and we want you to come here to show all the risks and to show solutions, and you really start convincing all the negotiators at COP. So I hope it will be effective. But let me tell you what, in my opinion, is the biggest social challenge, the social transitions. You know, it's a big mystery. You know, statistics showed 69% of all inhabitants of G20 countries, they are not climate deniers, 69%. And then, unfortunately, in all democracies in the world, voters are electing populist politicians all over the world. It's not only US and Argentina. In Amazon, last year, the mayors, the councilmen, councilwomen, all 750 cities and towns elect 80% of populist politicians. A lot of these populist politicians are climate deniers. And these politicians in the Amazon, they want to continue deforestation, fossil fuel exploration. So this is a mystery why we, 70% almost, we are not climate deniers, and why in democracies we are electing these politicians. So I think this is a big social risk, policymakers, why? So I just want to say we have really to change that, because, you know, science shows the risk of climate change. As I said, 69% all inhabitants in G20, the most population in the world, we are not climate deniers. Why are we electing climate deniers as presidents, governors, mayors? And even in Brazil, we elect President Lula, who fortunately is very concerned about climate. He was only 1.8% ahead of the former president. The former president, Bolsonaro, climate denier like Trump, like Milei, Argentina. He was anti-science. He was against wearing masks, taking vaccines during the COVID. You know, imagine if he had been reelected, like Trump has been. No COP30 in Belém. Brazil would continue increasing emissions, deforesting, destroying, and also he was supporting organized crime. So that's a big challenge. Why we are in all democracies in the world electing more populist politicians.
These are all fantastic comments. I want to give Ashley an opportunity to, if you would like to respond to any of these that have already
Yeah, really briefly. I think what you highlight for me is the worlds of law and diplomacy are not really designed in the same way as science. And I kind of think on like the US national level, at least as a law student, this the kind of thing law students think about is the you know, we don't think about quantifying things, it's all qualifying things. So like causation and redressability, these are the things that we talk about in law school, second year law school, first year law school, certainly. And like attribution science is something that really needs to be brought to the courtroom, let's say. I think about one case, and I'm probably picking the wrong case, but I think it's Haub v. Montana, where there was a positive opinion that said that we can't have any more greenhouse gas not being redressable. This is like one more drop in the bucket. But one more drop in the bucket is not really quantifying anything. It's great that happened, but we need to be informing it with more hard science as part of the decision-making process. So I think that's my take.
Wonderful. Well, I do want to add, I had the opportunity to be at the Planetary Science Pavilion on the day that Dr. Norbury kind of officially started the pavilion, and I really highly recommend that. And I'm surprised that it is, again, the first time in 30 COPs that it's been there. And the points that Professor Mackey talked about in terms of how we can embed science much more thoughtfully into the negotiations process. There's definitely been work through some of my colleagues who've been trying to work on expanding that climate literacy work within even the COP negotiators, but not the high level COP negotiators, of the folks that are supporting them. And again, I think the problem is that that's not always happening. The other issue is also diplomats change with presidents and with different administrations coming through. So you don't have that continuity that we used to have, let's say, during the Montreal Protocol period, right? I do also want to quickly comment on the ICJ advisory opinion piece. All three of these opinions that came out of these different courts, the ICJ, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and now we have something that's coming out of the African courts as well. Things we want to remember is that these judges also relied heavily on the science that was provided to them. And I think that says a lot. The highest courts in these regions in the world turn to the science and listen to the science. And that was very much a huge part of that. And they even talked about attribution science as well. They couldn't engage with it in the legal context that we want in terms of the causation piece that Ashley was talking about, but they really engaged with the science and referred to the attribution science possibility as well. So I think, the higher levels of legal profession is looking to this as well. We now need to have the diplomats also doing the same and the negotiators doing the same in a much more thoughtful way of including science. So I think I have not too many minutes left. 2 minutes left. So in the last 2 minutes, I think one of the things that came out of this conversation was there's a lot of really distressful realities that we have to deal with. The truth is not pleasant. How do you continue to keep doing this work and maintain a positive mindset? Is there things that give you positivity, and what can we take away from why you are all still doing it 30, 40 years on? You knew about climate science and the issues with Earth systems that we were going to face, but you're still doing it. What is keeping you positive through all this?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I was a scientist for more than 40 years working in the Amazon. I was the first scientist who did the study in 1990, 1991 about the Amazon tipping points, all those things. But then 5 years ago, I said, I have to also look for nature-based solutions. So I start a project called Amazonia 4.0, and also we are going to have a meeting on Saturday there at the Planetary Science Pavilion that we are going to launch what we are trying to do, creating an Amazon Institute of Technology. And this is for creating what we call a social bioeconomy of standing forests with the biodiversity projects, bringing the indigenous knowledge to this Institute of Technology. So I'm saying I'm working now a lot in looking for solutions to save the Amazon. I think it's totally feasible. We are working hard on that.
Wonderful. Something local and concrete that's happening. Thank you, Dr. Neville. Dr.
Well, I think psychologically I'm an optimist, at least operationally, and I probably got my parents to thank for that, But as Carlos said, we are in a privileged position of being scientists and researchers and having the support of our university and research institutions. So, we have an obligation to share our knowledge and expertise and help people address this problem. So what gives me hope is when you do that, there are everywhere I go, there are people and communities and organizations hungry for knowledge, hungry to find solutions, wanting to make a difference. And really it's everyone out there that makes me optimistic, because I can see the energy and the passion and the commitment of people, who want to make a difference.
Thank you. And Ashley, do you want to talk about it from a law student's perspective of how are you trying to stay positive?
Well, clearly law is moving slower than science, but I do think we're seeing some positives, even if just aesthetically the inclusion of youth voices, indigenous voices. Perhaps yesterday shows that it's not quite as far as it's supposed to be. But yeah, the idea that the knowledge and truth can include indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, grounded knowledge, as well as the scientific knowledge, and that needs to be incorporated into the law. And I think that's becoming more of a common agreed upon. So that's my positive.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So the last thing I want to end on is Dr. Norbury mentioned about the sociological issues that we're facing and how we've had this trend in nationalism. Something that kind of really struck me at one of the events that I attended yesterday was the discussion about communication and how effective communicators can do a really great job of like responding to some of the issues, because the folks who have become populist are effective communicators. Like whether we like them or not, that is something that they are good at. So I think what I'm going to ask, and is a challenge to the audience, is you are all lawyers now who have now heard the science. You are, you have gained that knowledge and awareness. It is also up to you to communicate that well to your colleagues and your friends, your family, not just those who are in the legal profession. And I say the same with the scientists as well. I think you are all doing a great job in the work you do. We also need to have great communicators coming out of the science experts. And we're lucky we have two great communicators with us today, because that's why we're all here. So join me in thanking my wonderful panelists. And with that, who am I turning it over to? Oh. Thank you so much.
Yes, we'll see more.
I'll see you all on site. All right. So I have been given some instructions. Okay, all right. So next up, we have a Zoom panel that we're starting with. We have the second panel. The topic is the international law of state obligations for climate, which is perfect because we did just mention about the ICJ advisory opinion before. To moderate the panel, we have Professor Dr. Bharat Desai, who's the Humboldt Award Professor from Bonn University in Germany. Following and along with him, we have two panelists, Professor Christina Voigt, who is the chair of the IUCN Commission on Environmental Law from Norway. And we're also joined by Professor Camilla Bustos, who is a professor at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. And we are joined by a youth commentator, Maria Lambert, who is also at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator.
Yeah, so Achinta, you want me to start?
Yes, Dr. Desai,
Okay,
please
fine.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning to everyone in Belém. It's a pleasure for me to join from University of Bonn in Germany. This opportunity to have a the panel discussion on the side event, which coincides with the COP30 in Belém in Brazil. I think the subject of the panel discussion is very pertinent, very interesting. I think it was alluded to in the previous panel also, because since we have seen the global climate regime has completed 33 years, starting with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we have three legal instruments: the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. So after 33 years of the global climate regime, now we have come across, there was a flurry of legal initiatives taken in the forum of the international courts and tribunals, and we have so far have three remarkable advisory opinions given. So this is something, well, scholars have looked at this development from different angles. Some have looked at it from a giving a push to the development of international climate law. Some have taken a look at a different kind of a thing about the workability or not workability of the climate regime and how to strengthen it. And that was exactly the raison d'être, of the specific request made by different actors. Like in case of the International Court of Justice, it was the plenary organ. The UN General Assembly made the request to its principal legal organ to provide the opinion. In case of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, it was the Chile and Colombia. The two member states of the Organization of American States made the request. And in case of the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, it was the Commission on Small Island states in international law that made the request. And the the ICJ opinion came on 23rd of July this year. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights opinion came on 2nd of July, although it was decided on 29th of May. And the ITLOS opinion came on 21st of May. Now the cumulative effect of these, although the different requests were worded differently, the thrust has been different, the composition of each of these ICTs has been different. Like in case of the ICJ, it was 15 judges. In case of the Inter-American Court, it is the 7 judges. In case of the ITLOS, it's 21 judges, And I saw it's very, very amazing kind of a mosaic which has been put into place, for the scholars, to literally to try to put them under the scanner. At the journal which I am editing, I have taken the initiative to have a special issue of the journal on International Courts and Tribunals Advisory Opinion on climate change. And about more than a dozen scholars have given confirmation, and Professor Nicholas Robinson has been the first one, as usual, to take the lead. And his article is already published. Some 4 thoughts on the opinion of the International Court of Justice, and it has been widely circulated. I take this opportunity, I think, to welcome a distinguished panel, and especially I was told, of course, Professor Christina Voigt, dear friend and colleague, Professor of International Law at Oslo, and she appeared, on behalf, made the oral argument on behalf of the IUCN, before the International Court of Justice. And we have another distinguished, colleague, she. Camila Busta, she appeared, before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and we have the third, the youth commentator Maria Lambert, So without much ado, I thought I'll stop here and I'll invite the panelists, to make their presentation. And since we have only 1 hour, probably maybe we can start with about 10 minutes for each of the panelists, and then we can take a second round if the time permits. So maybe I'll start. Ask Christina to give her opening comments. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you to the Pace Law School and to FGV for the kind invitation and for this event. I think it's a very timely and very important event to delve deeper into the role of law when it comes to climate change. Well, I was just introduced. I'm a law professor at the University of Oslo, and I acted as lead legal counsel and represented IUCN before the International Court of Justice, before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea in the written and oral proceedings. I did not get any instructions. I prepared about a 20 minutes presentation. Maybe I can try to cut it short, but I wasn't quite expecting a 10-minute time limit. But okay, let's see how we go. Just some preliminary words why these advisory opinions matter so much. And I was able to listen in a little bit to the previous panel. And I think it's a very important moment where we are right now, where the science that we've had for a long time and the policies that have been laid out for a long time are now accumulating to where we see we need the law, right? We need the 3rd pillar of power to get governments to do what they need to do. And what we got from these 3 international courts so far, and we were waiting for the African Court on Humans and People's Rights and their advisory opinion, is that clarification what the law is, so that we can really use the law as a tool in getting lawmakers domestically to do what they need to do under international law. I think that is a very important moment that we can use the language of law, right? It's not just science, it's not just nice to do, it's an obligation to address climate change and protect the climate system. Now, I do have some sort of presentation, but I won't put it up given that's only 10 minutes. What I wanted to do is to give a very brief, my take on why I think the ICJ advisory opinion is particularly important. And then I picked out about 10 main aspects, but I may cut them short, of what I think are the most important elements of the advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice. Now, you already mentioned, Bharat, the history, and I think we all know the history of how the request came to the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice being the highest judicial organ in the United Nations system. But I do want to underline the role that youth played in this whole journey, from the initial discussions in the South Pacific all the way to promoting that journey and the outcome of what the court said on the 23rd of July this year. I think that is a very, very important role that young people, that youth, that students have played, that is unparalleled in the history of international courts. Now, we all know that the court was asked two very fundamental questions. The first one was, what are the obligations of states to address or to protect the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions for present and future generations? A very fundamental question that was open, that was not clarified until the ICJ came with its advisory opinion. And the follow-up question was, what are the legal consequences if these obligations are not complied with and if harm to the climate system is caused? So that's a kind of a build-up question on the answer of the first question. And you also know that there were two sub-questions or sub-elements to that second question, paying particular regard to vulnerable states, to injured or specifically affected states, and to future and present generations. Now, why do I think this case was historic? And there are different opinions on whether that's historic or not. I definitely think it was historic. First of all, because it was the biggest case ever in front of the ICJ and its predecessor. We had about 100 states that participated and about 12 international organizations, including the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, which I represented. And that is unparalleled in terms of the sheer number of participants in this case. And you perhaps know there is no possibility to submit an amicus curiae brief to the ICJ. That is not possible. So you either have to be a party or you have to be authorized by the court as an international organization to participate. There is no other way to participate in the proceedings. And given that, it is really very historic that there were so many participants. The second point that I wanted to underline is that for many small island developing states and for many least developing countries, this was the first time ever that they were in contact with the ICJ. They had never been in contact with, many of them had never been in contact with the ICJ, that court in The Hague, in the Netherlands. But this time they wanted to appear in front of the court. And that is also historic, that it was a forum for every state, and every state who wanted to participate had an equal voice. It was also historic, as we all know, because the ICJ has not a very long track record in terms of environmental cases. There are a few cases that we all know, Gapchi, Copenhagen, and so forth, pulp mills, but the court had never said anything about climate change before. So nobody knew what the court was going to say on the issue of climate change. And the fourth and last element that also makes it historic, as Ashinti mentioned, is that it was one of 3 advisory opinion procedures that went on almost parallel with ITLOS and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which at the very core dealt with very similar questions. Basically, what are states' obligations to address climate change, either in the context of the law of the sea, or the American Convention on Human Rights, or the general jurisdiction of the ICJ being able to use any source of international law. So what the outcome are, we all know, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of points, and I hope you let me do that, Bharat. I try to be brief. The first element I wanted to highlight is that the ICJ advisory opinion was anonymous, right? There was no dissent. The whole bench agreed. And that has a particular bearing, given that the request came from the United Nations General Assembly and the request got an unanimous answer from the court, speaks something to the seriousness and to the clarity of the answers that the court gave. It's an advisory opinion, yes, which by itself is not legally binding, but every single obligation that the court outlined is a binding obligation. It's either under treaty laws to the parties to the treaties or under customary international law to every single state. So that is just to have that outright here to be said. The second point refers back to what the previous panel was discussing on the role of science. You perhaps know that the ICJ invited some representatives of the IPCC a couple of days prior to the oral hearings, and you see references to the IPCC and the latest science that we have from the IPCC throughout the entire opinion, that the court leaves no doubt that it's scientifically established that increases in concentrations are due to human activities and that its consequences of climate change are severe and far-reaching. And the court went so far to identify it as a severe and an existential threat or existential problem of planetary proportions that imperils all forms of life and the very health of our planet. So that's the tenor that goes through the entire advisory opinion in terms of what the science says, and the court did not leave a speck of doubt about climate science. Now, the third point that I wanted to highlight is the whole scope of obligations that the court identified. Well, we knew about the climate treaties, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, but the court laid out the entire spectrum of treaty law, including human rights treaties, United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, Convention on Biological Diversity, and more, in addition to international customary rules, in particular duty to prevent significant harm to the environment of other states, and the duty to cooperate. This is a very large spectrum of obligations that states have in parallel. They are parallel, independent obligations, none is lex specialis, none sets aside the others. That's very important because basically wherever we look now in international law, there is an obligation to address, a legal obligation to address climate change. The fourth point very briefly links perhaps most directly to the COP in Belém and the negotiations and discussions there, or let's hope so. And that deals, of course, with the legal obligations under the Paris Agreement. The court identified the Paris Agreement as the primary treaty to deal with climate change, and it very clearly identified the obligations on mitigation, but also on adaptation, but the court put a focus on mitigation under the Paris Agreement. Now, we all knew already that parties have an obligation to communicate NDCs every 5 years as an obligation of result. That was not a question really to anyone. That was clear. And that's why we have the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee, where I'm a member, because we check on whether parties have communicated their NDCs. But in addition, and that's really, really important, the court made very clear that NDCs are not just a black box, right? NDCs is not just something that parties sent to the UNFCCC Secretariat and done with it. NDCs, with respect to NDCs, parties also have obligations of conduct. In particular, when they prepare their NDCs, they have an obligation of conduct with regard to the content of the NDCs, what they put in their NDC, what ambition, what targets they put in their NDCs. That was not so clear prior to the ICJ's opinion, but this is now clarified by the court, where the court says that states must satisfy certain standards under the Paris Agreement as due diligence obligations. And these standards are the requirement of progression, right? That every time parties submit an NDC, it becomes more and more demanding, but also that they're at the level of their highest possible ambition under Article 4, Paragraph 3. They have to be informed by the outcome of the global stocktake, and they have to be aligned, collectively aligned with 1.5 degrees. So these are very, very important clarifications, and I can only hope that parties bring it to the COP and discuss it there in pushing each other to increase ambition. The last point on the Paris Agreement is that it's also an obligation of conduct to implement your NDC. That was also not quite clear. I had the privilege of negotiating the Paris Agreement for the government of Norway, and that question whether the implementation of your NDC is actually part of your legal obligation or not was somewhat ubiquitous. And the ICJ now cut through all the ambiguity and it said also to implement your NDC by adopting national measures, laws, and regulations, including the regulation of private actor. That's an obligation of conduct which has to be carried out with stringent due diligence. So these are very, very, very important findings. Now, the other elements that I just very briefly mentioned is that, of course, there are obligations under international human rights law, under the international covenants, under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so forth, where the court referred to already emerging case law, but it made very clear that states have the obligation to take all necessary measures to protect the climate system through mitigation, adaptation, regulation of private actors under human rights law, independent from the Paris Agreement, independent from other law. That same applies to the Law of the Sea Convention, where the court squarely referred to the advisory opinion by the International Tribunal on Law of the Sea, which came out about a year earlier, where the ITLOS, the tribunal, clarified that greenhouse gas emissions are pollution of the marine environment, emissions from all sources, not just from vessels on the oceans, but also from deforestation, from coal-based power plants and so forth on your territory. Everything is pollution of the marine environment, and therefore states have obligations to prevent, reduce, and control pollution from any source under Article 191 of UNCLOS. And the ICJ squarely took in what UNCLOS said and followed the argumentation of the International Tribunal on the Sea. Now, the next point was a very important one on customary international law, and that was perhaps the most controversial element. If some of you have listened to the oral proceedings that were conducted 2 weeks last December, and the arguments by the participants went in all directions when it came to customary international law. While some states would argue customary international law is really the only law that applies to this question asked to the court, while there were some states who said customary international law doesn't apply at all to protecting the climate system. Now, the court was very clear and said that the duty to prevent significant harm to the environment also applies to the climate system, and it didn't leave any doubt that the customary international rule is applicable to the climate system, and so is also the customary rule of duty to cooperate, and both are based on stringent due diligence. And what is really important is that the court gave a whole list of elements that need to be satisfied in order to check whether a state has acted with that requisite due diligence. These have to be appropriate measures based on scientific and technological information, relevant international standards, and so forth. You probably have seen that list before. This is a very, very important finding because this applies to every state, whether party of the Paris Agreement or not. This is customary international law applicable to all. Now, when it comes to the second question, and that's my last point here, is that the court kept the answer rather short. It said, yes, the law on state responsibility applies if there is an internationally wrongful act, and an internationally wrongful act may arise if any of the obligations that it outlined in answering question 1 is breached, right? If you have a breach of an international obligation, and if this breach is attributable to a state, then you have an internationally wrongful act, and that gives rise to state responsibility with the consequences of reparation, in particular restitution and compensation, which was, of course, at the core of the question and satisfaction, in addition to cessation of the wrongful act and non-repetition. So that's very clear, but it's also very logical under international law. Finally, the court highlighted the limitations of international law in a very wise final paragraph of the advisory opinion, where the court said international law it ultimately plays a limited role, right? This is a complex problem which can only be resolved by bringing together all fields of human knowledge, whether it's law, science, or economics, or any other. But eventually, it is human will and human wisdom to change our habits, to do things differently, to change our comforts and current way of life in order to secure a future for ourselves, and those are yet to come. Now, Bharat, with that, I think I gave the floor back to you. I have some thoughts about what happens next and what the expectations are, or where this can come in, but maybe we can come back to that a little later. Thank you so much. Back to
thank you. Thank you for encapsulating so nicely the thrust of the background and the content of the ICJ's opinion. We have just, I think, we have to wind up. I think by 4:30, miss about. We don't have much time, maybe about half an hour left, So we'll see. Now, I think what you alluded, this will be very interesting in the sense that two important aspects probably, in terms of the obligations of the state, I think many of the sovereign states, probably caution the states in the written opinion, including, I think, a written statement by India, which I had the, opportunity to provide the draft written statement, where it was said that the court may exercise due caution to avoid devising any new and additional obligations beyond what is already agreed under the existing climate change regime. So it will be a matter of curiosity to see how did the court circumvent this kind of a consistent argument on the part of the all those states which appeared before. Did the court devise any new and because this is always if you see the history of the ICJ advisory opinion, courts have the tendency to look into something which is not even asked. I think so we'll see that if the time permits. I think I'll come back to you again. Now, Camilla, over to you. In especially to little focus upon what transpired at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and how the court explicitly, like in case of the ICJ's advisory opinion, where the court has declared the climate change as existential problem of planetary proportion. And I think there is a similar kind of observation in the final dispositive given by the Inter-American Court, where it said it's a climate emergency, for instance. So over to you, Camilla.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm stuck in Florida. I wish I was in New York with Maria, but the government shutdown canceled my flight. Anyways, happy to be here with you all. I just wanted to actually piggyback very quickly on Christina's sort of comments about the ICJ, because I think they tie really nicely into what the Inter-American Court did or didn't do. And I'll say that one of the most, I think, striking provisions in the opinion was the one dealing with fossil fuels, right? So for the first time, the ICJ also clarifies the obligations of states in the context of fossil fuel production, and it names it expressly, right? How the failure to take appropriate action, whether that's through fossil fuel production, consumption, the granting of exploration licenses, the provision of subsidies, right? All of those things may constitute an internationally wrongful act. And I think this text it gives me at least a lot of hope in terms of naming the industries, naming the actors behind the climate crisis in a way that we didn't have this sort of language before. And if you think about Baku, right, and the negotiations, how they ended in the last year, but also prior COPs, there's been so much fight about actually naming the polluters, right? Naming the fossil fuel industry, among others. And so I think this is a really powerful example of how the ICJ opinion is not just clarifying the obligations, but also extending and bringing in private actors in addition to states. Anyways, so that's my my 2 cents on Christina's wonderful presentation. And you know, the Inter-American Court, as you know, issues its advisory opinion in the context of obviously other international tribunals trying to understand the dimensions of the climate emergency. And what I think is really interesting is that we're now having this international discussion where we are trying to figure out what are the boundaries, what are the parameters, what is conduct that maybe was lawful, right? Pre advisory opinions, and that now we know it's not, because we have a very clear articulation by the ICJ, by IDLOS, by the Inter-American Court. Now, I think the Inter-American Court most importantly distilled a jus cogens obligation, right, to not cause irreversible damage to the climate, and in this way, it's almost like a little stronger than the ICJ opinion. And the Inter-American Court can do that because it has a jurisprudence that allows it to build to build off of. A little different than the European Human Rights Court and, of course, the ICJ. And so what the court does, right, is point to how international principles of environmental law, like precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, intergenerational equity, and fundamental human rights, basically, you know, give rise to this obligation not to cause irreversible damage. Of course, this opinion is also building on its precedent 7 years earlier that recognized an independent right to a healthy environment. So we have, you know, these decisions that have been building and building towards the advisory opinion on climate. And I think what's most exciting about this is kind of what will come after. I'll get, you know, I'll briefly discuss some of the things that I think are interesting, but to me, the legal foundation that both the ICJ, but also the Inter-American Court opinion are now providing for future climate litigation is exciting, right? The idea that we now have this authoritative language that can bolster cases in domestic courts, in regional courts, and that, again, in many ways vindicates what communities have been saying for a long time. I think there's something really important there. So I think we can anticipate that both of these opinions are very much going to be used, you know, by advocates in the near future. Now, the Inter-American Court takes, I think, a really interesting approach to remedies. And Christina touched a little bit on what the ICJ does here. The court, the Inter-American Court is known for creative hands-on approaches, right? It has a history of developing remedies in the context of sort of dictatorships, transitions to democracy. And so here it gives the creation of really kind of creative administrative and judicial mechanisms tailored in the climate context. So, for example, measures to protect and restore nature, medical care for climate-related illnesses, compensation, guarantees of non-repetition, but also preventative measures to monitor. And here's where I think we can see probably the most pioneering language on climate remedies at the international level. Now, unlike the ICJ, which has this like stringent diligence, the Inter-American Court has an enhanced diligence standard. And I don't think there's a lot of sort of differences here, but I do think the Inter-American Court does allow us to sort of take this a little further than the ICJ opinion might. And I think what's really, really interesting about this opinion is the way in which it imposes very express obligations on corporate actors. So, of course, the opinion's about the obligations of states, and that was very much one of the questions that was sought, right? That was included in the request. But here the court is building on its own jurisprudence, right? And basically saying, states, you have an obligation to guarantee that climate rights extend beyond the state, right? That we actually are also ensuring and guaranteeing that non-state actors are very much not violating human rights, right? And so there is this very clear obligation on private actors. And then the court sort of cites its jurisprudence and points to, obviously, the sort of recent case in Peru, La Oroja versus Peru, which again a case about sort of corporate accountability, but similarly about the failure to the failure of the state to regulate a private company that was releasing toxic emissions and of course harming human health and the environment. So I think here we have some really interesting language about what states have to do in terms of course legislation, regulation, administrative measures, but then the obligations that the companies have to meet their due diligence standards, right? And that this is going to go and apply throughout the supply chain, that they should be subject to continuous monitoring, that there should be public access, right, to information, and again, adequate pathways to public participation and accountability. So I think this is quite powerful. There are two other things related to companies that I think are really interesting. The one has to do with transparency and anti-greenwashing, right? So for the first time, again, we get this really kind of clear language about companies' responsibility to not engage in greenwashing, right? The idea here that, you know, companies have a duty to not use pro-sustainable development language to hide what they're really doing, and that they have also an obligation to basically disclose and be transparent about their greenhouse gases, their emissions, and then the implementation of measures. And again, I think this is really exciting in terms of thinking about climate litigation and where this kind of can move forward. And then the other sort of novel development here is that we've all heard of sort of the CBDR, right? The common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principle, and how that clearly has been applied and at the center of global South and global North debates during COPs. And since the development of international environmental law. But here, the court is actually taking that environmental principle and applying it to corporations and saying there's differentiated obligations also for corporate actors, depending on what historical emissions they've emitted, right? Where they've been domiciled, you know, thinking about, again, their value chain, but also how historical behavior kind of informs current obligations. So I think this is all really, really interesting. I know we're running short of time, so I'll take a few more minutes to sort of say a couple more things. In terms of course, recognizing the right to a healthy climate, again, I think the emergence of the right to a healthy climate is probably one of the most important parts of the opinion, right? Recognizing for the first time that, of course, humanity requires the conditions of a stable and safe climate in order to protect other human rights protected under the American Convention. And so this independent recognition, I think, is really, really important. And again, built on a lot of the jurisprudence around the right to a healthy environment. And again, this in parallel to the ICJ imposes very clear obligations, right, on what countries need to do to mitigate and adapt, and that the fact that that mitigation target needs to account for current historical emissions, capabilities, circumstances, that sort of thing. And then I'll just sort of end by saying that I think the other piece here, and I think this probably will hopefully sort of jump into Maria's remarks, right, is that this intergenerational equity is at the center of honestly many of these opinions, right, from the history of how they came to be, but also in the Inter-American Court advisory opinion, where, you know, intergenerational equity is very much one of sort of the guiding principles, along with non-regression and the recognition, right, that states have legal obligations to not impose disproportionate burdens on future generations. And here, I think the court is very much in conversation with you know, a climate case in Germany, New Bayer, right, and very much again demonstrating that this is not a sort of domestic issue, but it's an international conversation. And again, recognizing not only intergenerational equity, but other sort of vulnerable groups, right? Women, indigenous peoples, campesinos. So again, kind of using this intersectional lens that the court has often used when it thinks about vulnerability. So I think that was 10 minutes. So I'm gonna end there and pass it back to you, Brad.
Maybe, yeah. Thank you. I think thank you for concluding that. So I think it's a very, very interesting what some of the aspects which you have already mentioned. But I think probably, when if the time permits, I'll come back to you as to if you can little focus on that if you compare both what Christina mentioned about the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, the 15 judges who gave the opinion, and here the 7 judges who gave the opinion on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. You find that so much kind of a difference of opinion here, where the ICJ's opinion is unanimous, much more, it's ICJ was actually covering a very, very broader canvas of the treaty law, customary law, and other things. Here, although the Inter-American Court was confining to its own remit of the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights and other things, what will you attribute so far as this, barring duty for cooperation, or like even on the issue of use cogens, there is a difference of opinion. There is a split vote. Just out of 7 judges, they have not been able to agree upon even what was the request which was made to them. Now I'll come back to you, but finally I'll turn to the third panelist. I think if she's there, Maria Lambert, if she's there, the youth commentator.
Hi, I'm right here.
Okay, please, yeah. Okay, Maria, over to you. I think from your perspective, probably how do you read, whatever one or the other advisory opinions, and especially if you can little connect with what happened, during the the 2024 summit for the future, the pact for the future, where there is a explicit reference to the future generations, especially having a so probably you can just give a little reflection on that. Yeah, over to you, Marie.
Thank you, Dr. Desai, and I want to thank the 2 panelists before me. I feel like a lot of the points you've covered flows right into the things I look forward to in the future. Before I begin, I want to quickly talk about the reason why I started in environmental law. It goes back into growing up in Delhi. And over the past 2 weeks, Delhi has been one of the most polluted cities in the world, with an AQI over 1,000, making the air literally toxic for the millions of inhabitants in Delhi. And Delhi sits at the nexus of the triple planetary crisis, facing climate crisis, pollution, and biodiversity. And we've had a lot of protests in the last few days, which had banners from youth reading, "I want to breathe. I want to be able to breathe." And this is why it was important to link the climate crisis to human rights obligations, because climate crisis is human rights. The ability to not breathe, the ability to be choked by pollution affects your right to life, affects your right to employment, affects your right to have a family, and every other right you could potentially think of, which has been enshrined in international human rights law. So the human rights nexus, which has been brought forth by the ICJ opinion, as well as the Inter-American Code of Human Rights, sort of brings in an important lens, because in developing countries, often right to environment has been countered with the right to development. But when you bring in the human right lens, it brings into a lot more attention that the development has to be rooted in human rights, and development cannot be at the cost of human rights, and brings in a lot more emphasis on what sustainable development means. The second thing I want to talk about is, as Professor Bustos spoke about, the intergenerational aspect. International law, and especially international environmental law, and one of the first customary international laws, which customary international principle, which I came across, was the permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which was then the caveat was introduced through the prevention of transboundary harm, through the trail smelter case. And I feel like the 2 advisory opinions sort of bring in another lens to the permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which is the intergenerational equity, wherein the language of it talks about that states need to be responsible not just to harms across borders, but across generations. And this brings in a new lens, and this brings in a new hope for intergenerational equity to be read in as a customary principle of international law, and dictate actions of states as well as private actors. The third thing I really look forward to is an increased amount of climate litigation, not just towards government actors or towards private actors, as has been the case, but towards holding states responsible for not regulating and holding accountable private actors. the advisory opinion brings us language where states have an obligation to regulate, to bring in principles to hold private sector accountable, and I look forward to having climate litigation cases which sue states for not doing so. I also look forward to climate litigation cases against private sector, not just towards the traditional oil and gas industries, but also towards industries who do have an impact in climate change, who do have an impact in human rights of their workers, of the countries where they are where they have host operations, and towards failure to provide adequate adaptation measures which impacts the human rights and labor rights of the workers involved. The last thing I want to talk about, which was hinted at the last panel, was about climate deniers. We have an extreme of climate deniers, politicians who are climate deniers, but we also have climate change makers and countries who are actively taking forth the lead in climate action. But I want to talk about the third category, the symbolic supporters and the fence sitters, politicians and countries who are in between, who live in the legal inertia, who vote when it's convenient but do not really take an action, who wouldn't outrightly oppose the advisory opinion but wouldn't actively also change their national laws or bring in policies in compliance with the advisory opinion and international law, as has been the case over the past 70 years for many developing countries and many countries across. So I look forward, and I feel like the language specifically brought by the ICJ opinion in the way they have instructed what the NDC has to cover and also the implementation of the NDC. I hope this brings in a change in the legal inertia, which has been a disease in many countries, and bring forth policies which truly bring forth a new generation of climate action in both mitigation as well as adaptation, which is very much the need for my generation as we're struggling to breathe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, for making this very, very crisp observation on, the implications especially. And I thought I'll pick up from there. I think what you refer to, is, that the logical question which will arise, after these three advisory opinions, given by the ITLOS, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the International Court of Justice. The question is what next? And a lot of people have, surmised, kind of a different outcomes. In fact, like what Maria mentioned, that it could probably give a little push to the flurry of domestic climate litigations. That could be one of the impact. And the or kind of a probably objective was that it will nudge the sovereign states towards little more responsible behavior or other things. And so it opens the window. And let me bring in what Professor Nicholas Robinson mentioned in his four thoughts, that lead article coming out in issue 55 6, environmental policy and law. I think it will be coming out in maybe by end of this month. What Nick is referring to is that this outcome probably could take us forward from the de lege lata to de lege ferenda. Probably give a little push to the what kind of a can we expect some kind of a, since there was a widespread kind of a disappointment among the party even as the COP30 is underway in Belém in Brazil, that is not making much headway. A lot of things like the climate technology, climate funding is one of the most contentious issue, or like states has already withdrawn from the Paris Agreement repeatedly. Some states are the fund. So a lot of there are imponderable, there are a lot of difficulty. The question is how should things be steered into action. As the UN General Assembly will now pick up the thread, I think, as a logically acknowledging the advisory opinion given by the International Court of Justice. Hopefully, maybe if not by Christmas time, probably maybe next year. What could be the elements of that prospective resolution with the UN General Assembly? Because it's a political organ, it actually set the ball rolling way back in 1988, Resolution 4353, about describing climate change as a common concern of mankind. So the logical question, because I thought it would be very pertinent to ask the panelists this issue, that what could be the next outcome in terms of what Nick is saying, from de lege lata to de lege ferenda. Can it go into that future kind of a climate law? And what kind of future climate law could be there? Can there be a possibility, since the Inter-American Court has said it, the International Court of Justice has said it, climate emergency, what the UN Secretary General himself said in Stockholm Plus 50, called it's a really, the planet is on fire. It's one of the triple planetary crises. In fact, I had the chance to curate one of the very special issue of the environmental policy and law and the planetary future. It's available on the website. Those of you who have the interest, the question is, can it really propel the political organ, because the ball will be back in the court of the political organ. It's the political master, that can it give a little push to from the climate common concern to because since the crisis is planetary, there is a planetary emergency. Can it be designated as the planetary concern? Can that be one of the kind of a kind of a thing which could also be taken forward maybe by the conference of party within this climate regime, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And the last point, which probably Christina touched upon, and I thought maybe that she can elaborate on that part, that if you look at, even after saying everything, spelling out the obligations of the states, and also elaborating on what could be the consequences for any kind of a breach of international obligation, in terms of those things, even the court, those 15 wise men and women from the Hague, in the paragraph 456, I think probably they say above all, and that is really bringing us to the ground, that a lasting and a satisfactory solution requires human will and wisdom at the individual, social, political level to bring change in our habits, comforts, and current way of life. It really draws the reality in terms of that ultimately, unless and until, although we engage in legalism and all the conventions and everything, although and the climate change conundrum is becoming a little more and more trickier. The question is, we need to find a way out, to lead to a situation where what the primary objective of the climate convention in terms of stabilization of climate greenhouse gases at a particular level. So after 33 years, the question will be, what next? Will this cumulative effect of the advisory opinions will it really propel that kind of a political action? And I thought of maybe in the final few minutes our panelists can maybe little touch upon that part. What next? Maybe can it be a climate common concern to planetary concern, or can there be some kind of a legal push, which of course could be taken through the forum of the General Assembly? Yeah, over to you, Christina. Final comments.
Yeah, thank you, Bharat, and thanks to Camilla and Maria for their very thoughtful comments. I think the framing that we now have in the language of law is really important and needs to be taken seriously. I'm a little bit reluctant in moving on to thinking about what is now lex ferenda, because we just got the lex lata, right? We just got the courts to confirm what is the law, the lex lata. And I think we have to take this seriously and have to push that states actually implement what the different courts identified as the current legal obligations that exist. And I think this can be done in many ways. I mean, one of the core instruments that we have are the NDCs. There is no other way to think about it. And we've seen that NDCs are bending the curve. There is an ambition gap, there is an implementation gap, but we are very slowly getting somewhere where we need to be. That has not happened before, but it's happening now and has to be accelerated. It has to go more rapidly, more deeper, not just to net zero, but to net negative emissions by the end of the century. So we have to use what we have much more smarter than previously, because now we have the language by the court saying this is the law. So how many of us have engaged with our governments in the next round of NDCs that came forward this year? I have, but I think many have missed that opportunity. And that opportunity will come around, every 5 years from now. And I think that's a very, very important moment to engage with the decision makers domestically to push up ambition to the highest possible level aligned with 1.5. But that's not all. In addition to the policy and legislative cycles domestically, there will be and there need to be legislative changes. And I think Maria mentioned it very explicitly. The courts were very, very clear that governments have a regulatory due diligence. They have to regulate. They have to use their regulatory power to circumvent the private actors that are domiciled in their territories or under their control and jurisdiction. This hasn't happened yet to the extent it's necessary, but this is a message that came from the court, not just, but also with regard to fossil fuel production, consumption, subsidies, and licenses, where we get very clear indications. But we will also see domestic case law. We will see judges, and it's already happening, right? We already have like a handful of domestic decisions from domestic courts that already refer to the advisory opinions and use them in their argumentation domestically. They don't have to do that, but they do it because they are convincing arguments that judges now can use to strengthen their legal argumentation domestically. And I think we will see more of that in the years to come. And it is a call to researchers, like to people here in the room, to use their legal skills to delve deeper into what the courts have said. What did the court say on attribution, on causation? It was very vague. There's a lot that still needs to be done. And I think that call goes to everyone who does research, either law or science or whatever. So I think there's a lot that we can do and follow up on what we got from the courts. And I think that is something that we should consider collectively and how best to take forward. Thanks, Bharat, and back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Camilla, final comments? Yeah, we don't have much time now. Yeah, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Yeah.
I think Christina said it beautifully. I'll just say the one thing that I think is the elephant in the room, and it's the sort of legitimacy of courts and of law, right? And I think, this used to be limited to failed states, right? And nations that couldn't enforce, judgments. And we're seeing this across Western Europe, across in the United States, right? So I think this question, Bharat, that you pose is a really important one, because it's the question of the 21st century. It's not just about climate. It's what can law actually deliver, and can courts actually deliver climate justice, and not just in the letter of the law, but in the practice, right? And so I don't know. I think Christina said it beautifully. I think ultimately it's about raising the cost of non-compliance. Like, do the actors that need to comply, do they feel, because not only because it's their legal obligation, but are there other factors outside of the law, including, social mobilization, including reputational damage, that are there other things that can also help us think about how to implement and move the levers towards climate justice? I'll say that.
Yeah. Okay, Camina. Finally, yeah, Maria, do you have any input to give? What do you expect? In terms of, like you mentioned, a lot of youth, campaigns, agitation have been going on. The right to breathe, right to clean air. What are the expectations? What do you look for? Coming next? Yeah.
The law is inherently anthropogenic. All fields of law, whether it's tax law, corporate law, labor law, every single field of law is anthropogenic. And it has been through generations and generations of jurisprudence been tuned for profit. And I hope and I look forward to climate law not being a separate law like environment law has been, but climate law to be integrated into each and every field of law. And it is transformed so that the law is then for the planet and not for profit. So I would like to end with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That is very, very wise, I think, advice. Just to sum up, I think we are just almost close, coming to closer to of the session. I think it's very finely. I think the three international courts and tribunals have already said what they wanted to do. Those wise men and women have already mentioned about that. The crucial question will be, whether the sovereign states will walk the talk, because that is exactly what the court had tried to amplify, try to clarify. It was already there. The three regimes already mentioned about it. The courts have took the special pain to elaborate on what things are there. The question is, I think, probably in the conference of party meetings, probably how the COP, probably, because ultimately COP is also the political master, how they see to again take this message, because the advisory opinions have come just prior to the COP30. We are not, and we will wait till the next, the African Court of Human and People's Right, that will give its when, as and when that comes up, sometime in the future, But as of now, this corpus, which has been already provided by the three courts: International Court of Justice, Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the International Tribunal for Law. This, I think, more than enough, to provide the little room for proceeding ahead. At least we need to break the jinx, to propel the state, like you saw latest, when the UN Secretary landed in Belém, just a meeting with the Brazilian President Lula. I think that's also probably little cause of concern, because he is a very sensitive person, as he's a messenger who has often been shot at by a lot of people. He's the vulnerable target. He's the face of the United Nations. He has to receive, and I think, like, what we saw is, I hope and pray that doesn't happen. Like we have been speaking about 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Now the Secretary's statement, it says less than 2 degrees Celsius. So that is also a little because they say already we have overshot what the initial. So the question is, because the time is running out, the action is not happening. But I think what, Christina, you rightly put, so from the scholarly realm, what the parties and the sovereign states will do is a different matter. What the business will do is a different matter. But I think so far as our remit is concerned, the scholarly remit is concerned, both the scholars and the students know, I think, to think aloud and ahead and try to put our heads together and try to go deeper into it, look at from and this is exactly what as I mentioned, already spread out this process for this journal, Environmental Policy and Law, and it's I expect very interesting contributions to come out, as Susana Borias from Spain has provided a huge big article on Inter-American Courts contribution, and also Cecilia Silverberg from Argentina, she has provided a very and I expect about 10 to 12 more articles, including George Venula's and others. So I think the different perspectives of the scholarly perspectives, so it will be very interesting to see. So please watch out for the forthcoming issues of the Environmental Policy and Law. I think because all articles are free, and also I welcome if there are any interest. Like I've already sent out a request. I'm yet to have confirmation from Christina. I look forward to her contribution. Because she has appeared, and also maybe I will invite maybe to Camila if she also has the interest, to provide a perspective. So we look forward to this. I think the at least so far as our remit is concerned, we need to be on course to go into the deeper, to try to make sense of those things through our classrooms and through our research works. And we hope and pray. I think as I said, I wrote a special preface to this forthcoming issue where I said the international courts and tribunals as the climate change sentinels. So you can have the three advisory opinions, trying to, although it doesn't make a very long case about it, but at least we need to make sense of what the courts have said. And the question is whether the sovereign states will walk the talk. The court has done its part, and I think probably we again need to expect that the UN General Assembly shall have to bail the cat. Let us see what the Assembly tries to nudge because again the same sovereign states will be there. So we hope that the Assembly will try to before the term of this current Secretary General closes, maybe next year, hopefully some kind of a accelerated action could be there. So to insofar as the to address squarely the climate emergency. And I think I'll stop here. I thank all the panelists, Christina, Camila, and Maria, and we'll just stop it and close the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Bharat.
Thank you. Bye. Yeah.
So thank you so much, all the panelists, all the moderators. I would like just to say that we're going to have a break, and we were going to return at 1:30 p.m. So see you in an hour. Thank you so much.